Great. So thanks again, Vincent, for inviting me, and great to meet the other panelists, Michael, Diana, and Emily. So as Vincent said, my name is Torsten Geelan. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of Sociology, University of Copenhagen. And the title of my talk today is The Combustible Mix of Coalitional and Discursive Power, British Trade Unions, Social Media, and the People's Assembly Against Austerity. And basically this title is just lifted from a paper that I published about 6 months ago in New Technology Work and Employment. And basically to understand the genesis of this article, this paper that I wrote, you have to go all the way back to the financial crisis of 2008, when basically, countries all around the world were reckoning with the implosion of the financial sector. And of course, in the UK, some of you may remember or may know that the British trade union movement was in a historically weak position to harness all of this public anger against bankers and the financial sector, and also to, harness public anger against politicians and what they were proposing to do about resolving this crisis. In the UK, the Conservative Liberal coalition basically came up with a round of austerity measures, cuts to welfare and unemployment benefits. And so, of course, there was a lot of anger around this. And also research shows that in the mainstream media, national newspapers, television, radio, there was basically a endorsement of the austerity narrative, the idea that it was necessary, that it was just, and that this would somehow resolve the crisis that had taken place. And so, of course, unions were grappling with this. In the beginning, they focused their energies on trying to push the Labour Party leftward, and they, to some extent, began to succeed with that. And at the same time, in 2011, 2012, finally, you began to see this kind of, let's say, acceleration in local and national mobilizations against austerity measures. You had the British Trade Union Congress in 2011 organized a national demonstration, 250,000 people in the center of London. And then also importantly, you had the arrival of these new social movements, right? You had Occupy London, you had UK Uncut against corporate tax avoidance, and you had student mobilizations against cuts to fees. And of course, they were using the internet, social media to basically mobilize and facilitate all of these quite innovative actions. And so this was kind of the context, but by 2013, little had changed. The Labour Party was still kind of pursuing this austerity light position. The government in power had not really backtracked in any significant way. And there was this kind of soul searching within the anti-austerity movement, which the trade union movement, of course, was a part of. And what they realized was that they needed a national united campaign against austerity. And so there was an open letter in The Guardian, published with kind of a range of politicians, trade unionists, activists, and they basically called for people to come to a launch event to launch this new movement. And in 2013, 4,000 people showed up to a beautiful venue in the center of London, and basically the rest is history. And so at this point, I was doing my sociology doctorate, and I thought, well, it's fascinating to see how the union movement finally seems to be creating some new initiative that might be able to challenge this narrative of austerity, because they haven't succeeded so far. And of course, at the time, I was reading a lot of Manuel Castells, his book, Communication Power, where he's basically arguing that communication is kind of a central form of power in society. So I was thinking to myself, well, maybe this new People's Assembly can allow the union movement to challenge austerity by combining coalitional power and discursive power. And so I began to look at the power resources literature, for example, in this book by Rebecca Gumbrell McCormick and Richard Hyman. And I began to realize that while the definition of coalitional power was quite satisfactory and very well researched, also empirically, the definition of discursive power basically ignored the central importance of media and communication. There was a lot of focus on framing and the types of arguments that unions could present. But as the authors in that book themselves pointed out, basically, union frames don't have any agency unless they are circulated either internally within organizations or externally through society as a whole, right? So I thought, okay, well, that's very interesting. So how can we then develop this concept of discursive power further. And there I turned to the work of a professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, Bart Kemmerts, who had a book titled The Circulation of Anti-Austerity Protests. And basically what his theoretical approach allowed me to do was to put the 4 key communication processes that are involved at the center of a redefinition of discursive power. And so, long story short, I created this theoretical framework for my study, where I basically redefined discursive power as the capacity of trade unions to influence public debate. And then here comes the slight innovation, by producing and self-mediating frames and circulating through the media, so mainstream media, the internet, social media, and to a mass audience, right? And of course, this kind of conceptualization keeps in mind that, generally speaking, within the sociology of media, we can say with quite strong conviction that the mainstream media in general, as well as new social media, are basically arenas of power struggle that often support dominant interests. So in this place, and in this instance, capitalist interests, the interest of the state, the interest of the employers, the interest of the finance sector. And in fact, that's what you saw. Unions were very rarely seen in the mainstream media in the UK. Having said that, of course, sometimes progressive organizations such as unions can use new information and communication technologies, also more traditional media, to basically try to exercise discursive power, right? And to kind of challenge the status quo. So I came up with this little figure where you can basically see this process of production, self-mediation and circulation. And the important thing to keep in mind is that basically the UK trade union movement was invisible in the mainstream media. So they had to use social media to basically reach a mass audience, at least initially. And then, of course, they used these mobilizations with all these other actors in order to try to get visibility in the mainstream media, which of course is crucial for pushing the political agenda. Okay, so just in case I didn't say it already, so what was the research question exactly that was driving the case study that I then conducted? So the research question was basically, to what extent did the coalitional and discursive power of the People's Assembly help the British trade union movement challenge austerity measures in public debate, right? Focusing in particular on mainstream media. Okay, so data collection. How did I go about this? So what I did was I focused on the People's Assembly and the 2 key trade unions involved, Unite the Union, which is one of the UK's largest, and PCS, which is the 5th largest. And what they both shared at that time was that they had quite a radical orientation. They were quite focused on being involved in politics and in the political arena, with this kind of socialist bent. And so I conducted 7 interviews with trade union officials, and who were basically involved in the day-to-day running of the People's Assembly, as well as the national organizers that the People's Assembly had hired to organize these national mobilizations, as well as some of the activists who were involved in some of the local assemblies. And then on Twitter, I basically scraped 2 years worth of tweets, so about 5,600, which I then went on to analyze. And this was basically about 5% of all of the activity that they generated over this 2-year period. So it was a sample of a much larger data set. And last but not least, of course, I attended some of these national mobilizations, the 2 most important were which took place in 2014 and 2015. And here I am, a much younger version of myself here on the left-hand side at the national demonstration in 2015. Okay, so the methodology took a lot of inspiration from Vincent's work. It basically focused on 4 dimensions. So I looked at the strategy of the People's Assembly, its organizational form, and then this process of producing and self-mediating frames. And I basically coded the tweets thematically using codes found in the literature, as well as some that I came up with just by looking at the data itself. Okay, so what did I find? So first of all, the overall strategy, as I said earlier, of the People's Assembly was basically to create this broad anti-austerity coalition, putting emphasis here on the word broad. because what they were trying to do was they were trying to link together activists from not just the trade union movement, but also social movements, community groups, and solidarity campaigns, and to basically get them to engage in local and national political action, right? To put this anti-austerity message front and center. And of course, in order to do that, they basically engaged in a number of tactics and identified three that were particularly important. The first one was important to be able to get all of these disparate groups together, despite having very different ideological perspectives, different histories, different ideologies, and also a different kind of emphasis on political tactics. And so by using this policy of non-partisanship, by basically saying that we don't support any political party, they were able to get all of these people together in a room and to collaborate on the People's Assembly against austerity. The second thing they did was, as I said, they organized these local and national demonstrations, and they focused them at key moments in the political cycle. So, for example, before or after an election, or when there was the Party of the Conservative Conference, or whatever it may be. And of course, they used a range of what Burt's calls self-mediation practices, and I'll give a couple of examples in a second. And then last but not least, they use what, again, drawing on Vincent's work, has been called geographical propagation, which basically means that they allowed local assemblies to form all across England, Wales, and Scotland. So you see here in this image, you have about 80 different groups. They sprung up already within the first 12 months. So it was a very rapid growth. There was an appetite for this. Groups had between 5 and 30 activists at any one moment, and the most, how do you say, the most vibrant was Manchester, according to the interviewees, as well as Glasgow, Leeds, kind of the more northern cities, as you would expect, as well as those in London. Okay, so what organizational form did the People's Assembly take? So it basically could be characterized as a decentralized network of grassroots local assemblies, right, that were being centrally orchestrated by this national organization in London, which had these 2 full-time employees, which is where the kind of union officials would meet regularly to kind of supervise what was going on. And they put an enormous amount of emphasis on consensus decision-making, right? Again, because there were so many different groups involved. And in order to kind of sustain this coalition over time, in order to make sure that it didn't fracture, which is one of the classic problems of any coalition, especially when they're union-led, they created these 4 organizational bodies. So they basically were a management committee that was the union officials involved in the day-to-day running of it. You had these local assembly groups that I mentioned. You had a biannual assembly where basically all the local groups could send delegates where they would discuss the kind of the activities of the day. And last but not least, you had this motion-based national conference that took place every year where they would decide on what they would do moving forward. Okay, so let's look a little bit at social media. And again, I focused on Twitter, but you can tell a similar story if you were to look at Facebook or YouTube, as well as their website. So basically here we have Twitter posts and engagements over that 2-year period. And you can basically see that after the launch event, there was kind of a fairly steady rate of activity, but the real spikes in engagement and visibility and the circulation of these anti-austerity frames, of course, came with the 2 national mobilizations, right? Far outpacing actually the amount of posts that they produced, right? You can see this huge leap in engagement. And so then when we look at a little more like fine-grained analysis of these tweets, we find a couple of things that you would expect, maybe a couple of things that are a little bit more unexpected. So the first, of course, was that 1 in 5 tweets was basically motivational, trying to get people to go to rallies, demonstrations, events that the assembly was organizing. Then you had what's called archiving protest artifacts, which is a terminology that Barthes uses, I borrowed, where basically 1 in 5 tweets was documenting all of these different actions that were taking place. So that those who couldn't be there, for example, because they were caring for someone or they had to work or they were simply unable, they could basically still, share and participate in the movement, right? Then you had, of course, democracy. So 1 in 10 was basically focused on, publicizing meetings in local groups or regional groups or national groups. Then you had frame extension. So they were trying to, and they succeeded in using social media to supplement their offline coalition building strategy. At this point, they had about, I think, 60 different groups involved, signed up to the People's Assembly. So they supplemented this offline strategy with this online coalition building by, kind of retweeting and commenting on each other's posts and, raising awareness of each other's mobilizations. And then we had frame amplification. So basically, frame amplification was, not very large in terms of the amount of total tweets, but it did have quite a big impact on raising visibility of the movement. So for example, they used a lot of thunderclap campaigns at the time, where basically you get a certain amount of users, especially celebrities and people who have big followings, to sign up to tweet something at the same time. And this could usually generate an enormous amount of visibility around any particular action. And of course, also, how would you say, promoting all the different events that they were organizing on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so I've got about 3 or 4 minutes, I think, Vincent. 3 minutes, 2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, so what happened? So basically, June 20th, 2014, 8 years ago, there was a national demonstration, right? No more austerity, demand the alternative. Here we are in central London. And at this moment in time, the research on the mainstream media basically shows that the austerity narrative was still completely dominant in national newspapers, tabloid, television. So nothing had really changed. And they basically organized the mobilization outside the BBC headquarters, which is our national broadcaster. And there was an estimated 50,000 people who showed up. And basically, the reason why I have this picture of Russell Brand, who is a well-known celebrity in the UK and also to some extent in North America on the slide here is because this photo of him giving this fiery speech at the mobilization actually was shared 230,000 times on Facebook and a similar number on Twitter and so on and so forth. And basically the involvement of this celebrity, who at the time had 12 million followers, was enormously important for beginning to raise visibility around this movement, which hitherto had been ignored, right? Another thing that happened was that the BBC basically was ignoring this mobilization, and that became kind of a news story in its own right, the BBC blackout. So the activists used the internet to basically launch 6,000 complaints to the BBC, and eventually the BBC covered the mobilization. Fast forward a year later to 2015, this is kind of a post-election moment. The Conservatives just won an outright majority. There was enormous amount of anger and frustration, and the People's Assembly capitalized on this, and using the tweet, "Don't mourn, organize," managed to basically grow the mobilization 5 times over. So this time they had 250,000 people in central London, and they had more celebrities, more politicians, and they're all here displayed, walking at the front of the march. And also kind of indicative media analysis shows that this time they had much more publicity in the national tabloids, which reach, take, for example, the Daily Mirror reaches, millions of people. They were, being covered on television and radio. They did a lot of publicity work. They were better organized, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what happened next? Some of you may remember this. 3 months later, Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, one of the most socialist leaders of the Labour Party for many decades. And of course, the unions had a big role in this by pushing their members to vote for him. There was also this leftward shift within the Labour Party that had already been taking place since 2010. But my argument is that the other crucial factor to his election was the People's Assembly Against Austerity movement, which basically made millions and millions of people aware that there was an alternative, right? And basically, with Corbyn as the new leader of the Labour Party, again, research showed us that because we had a leader of the Labour Party who was elected on a distinctly anti-austerity agenda, suddenly that anti-austerity agenda became much more visible and legitimized in mainstream media coverage. And of course, also eventually, to some extent, the Conservatives were also forced to begin, kind of backtracking on some of it, not all of it, but at least on some of it, right? So conclusion with the last 30 seconds. So the first conclusion is basically this: I make this argument that the combination of coalitional and discursive power is combustible, that it can really revitalize unions if they're desperate enough to try to risk engaging in it. Again, something which is very common in the weaker union movements of the UK and the United States. The second is that this redefinition of discursive power basically allows us to better grasp how trade union movements try to influence public debate, especially during industrial and political conflicts. And then last but not least, just to say that in the post-2015 context, the People's Assembly kind of disappeared. A new organization was formed called Momentum, a socialist organization pushing the Labour Party to the left, and the People's Assembly just didn't seem so important. But that has now changed 7 years later. So basically, the COVID pandemic has come to an end. There's political chaos in the UK, and the People's Assembly has been revitalized. They have this march now on the 5th of November. And so who knows, I might even do a follow-up study. Thank you for your attention.